Okay, we're back and almost done with this module. Today's modules are a little bit on the short side in terms of content because the next module is more involved. So, last module, we basically introduced the structural hierarchy from atoms to organisms. Want to mention a few more things about this. So, often, if you've taken biology classes, you might have heard professors say that of these levels, the most important is the cell level. And I'm going to disagree on that. In fact, arguably, other faculty in my department hired me to tell them why they're wrong. A lot of other faculty, especially if you take biology 1198, they'll focus a lot on the cell. Um, in my opinion, if you just kind of put up with me a little bit, my argument is that the organism is the most important level. And here's the reason why. In our last module, we talked about what it means to be alive. Whoops, I don't know where that, there it is. That the organism is feeding, doing metabolism, and reproducing. And within this hierarchy, the only level that does all three of those is the organism. The organism is the thing that feeds. It's the thing that engages in reproduction. Yes, cells are involved in feeding, but so are organelles and atoms and organs and all of this. If you asked a chemist, they'd probably say the atoms are the most important, the molecules. Um, so in a way, this is a philosophical argument, but if we think about what life is and what life does, well, life is able to feed and reproduce, and the only thing here that does all of that is the organism. Okay? Technically, you could have surgery and remove your reproductive organ system. Well, you would no longer be able to reproduce that way, but you would still be a living organism. Okay. Similarly, you could have surgery and remove an arm, but still be a perfectly functional organism, even though you've lost part of a body, an organ, tissue, cells, etc. Okay. Fundamentally, it's the organism that is living that lives. Now, if you wanted to go above the structural hierarchy, I'm not going to go in here, but it's in the course packet. We're going to skip it. You can get above that when you're talking about ecology and evolution. When organisms reproduce, they become part of an evolutionary hierarchy of evolutionary lineages through time. Um, and as organisms interact with other organisms, they're also participating in an ecological hierarchy. But for the structural hierarchy, these are the levels. Now, I want to talk a little bit about medicine. We had said last module that for this class, there's really only four atoms we care about: chan, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. There's really only three organelles, if the life has it, that we care about: the nucleus, the mitochondrion, the chloroplast. If you're an animal, there's only four tissues: muscles, epithelial, nervous, and connective tissue. Put the word tissue when you're talking about the tissue, because if you say muscle, that's the organ. Epithelium is an organ, it's sometimes called skin. The nervous system is an organ system, okay? But either way, these are the four tissues that make up typical animals, and then they get combined into organs and organ systems. Now, think about your body or a human body. If you have interested in going into healthcare, you'll learn a lot about all these organ systems in anatomy and physiology and actually whole classes. But typically, if you think about the circulatory system, well, this is blood vessels, which are individual organs, and the heart that pumps the blood, and technically the blood. The blood's a weird thing. Blood's kind of a weird group of cells in a suspension. So it's kind of like a tissue, but it's not functionally a tissue because it's really liquid. So blood's a weird thing, but these are the organs of this organ system. And so blood vessels and heart, and also technically lungs, all work together more than they do with reproductive organs or brain or eyes. You can go to the respiratory system. It's basically the lungs and the way to get air into the body. The digestive system, ton of organs, but they're all primarily involved in feeding, in the mouth and getting it into there. There's enzymes secreted to digest food. The stomach, the pancreas, the liver, the intestines, all these things critically important in breaking down the food you eat into smaller things that your body then can use. Urinary system in females typically often linked together in OBGYN, but there's urology and gynecology. And In essence, if you look at the body here, each of these organ systems all work together as the organism. But typically, if you have an issue with one of your hormonal organs, it's going to affect the hormonal system, the endocrine system, more than it does other things. Okay, this is the nature of the structural hierarchy. Things within the same level interact more with each other than they do. And this is a hierarchy because if you have an issue with your heart, it can affect your organ system and you as an organism, but it's not going to affect tissues of other organs. It's going to be restricted primarily to that organ. So this is a hierarchy in this sense. Now I want you to think about medicine. If you go to med school and you become a general doctor, a physician, you pass your DO or MD kind of medical school qualifying exams and do some residency, then you've basically learned a lot about the whole system at all the different levels. Okay, part of the reason we want you to know organic chemistry and kind of anatomy if you want to go into healthcare. But some medical disciplines go on to specialties. And name some specialties. I'll give you an example of one, neurology. Can you name some other kind of medical specialties? You might have come up with, pause the computer if you don't have one. You might have thought of urology, gynecology, gastroenterology, which is the GI system, um, pulmonology, which is kind of circulatory system combined with respiratory system, endocrinology, neurology, skeletal system, muscle system tend to be combined into orthopedics. Um, uh, Most of the medical fields, cardiology, okay, most of the medical professions tend to focus on either an organ or an organ system. And so the specialties, the nature of medicine itself is really broken up according to the specialization within the structural hierarchy. General physicians know a lot about all of them, but if you have a issue of a particular organ, or organ system, you're going to focus on the specialist that knows more about that particular organ system and the organs that's involved with it and the tissues and the molecules that are involved. So basically, the medical profession, by and large, reflects the way in which the organism is composed and the way it functions, fundamentally how it functions. Again, this idea of structure and function. This is the structure, it's a structural hierarchy. And then when we understand how these things work and interact with each other, that's the function. Okay, and although this class will mostly focus on the structure and function of animals, be aware that plants have their own tissues and their own organs. For example, a leaf is an organ, a root is an organ, and they have their own organ systems. Plants have reproductive organ systems, they have hormonal systems. Okay, so this basic structure is true in all complicated organisms. Okay, and then the last thing we're going to end with, except for a review question, is this idea of development. Development is defined as the biological process by which a single cell becomes an adult organism, and it involves the growth and differentiation of cells and tissues and organs. And the way I like to think of this is development is how the molecules build cells that then build tissues, organs, organ systems, and the organ system. So development is the process by which typically the genetic components plus other things associated with the genetics within that first cell divides into two cells, to four cells, 8, 16, 32, 64, enormous numbers of billions of cells, all that build the tissues, the organs, and the organ systems. So development in a way is how these levels come into being. And development, in my opinion, is the most exciting and hot topic in all of biology, but especially organismal biology and cell and molecular biology and all the other fields. Most of the Nobel Prizes in medicine in the last decades and in your lifetime are going to be in this process. This is the field of biology we know the least about. It's the field that is the most exciting in terms of new discoveries. It really requires knowledge of all of the other levels in order to really piece it together, which is why it's a relatively late field. The number of theories in development are still rather low. We don't have a developmental biologist. Actually, we just hired somebody who does development. Um, In general, because they're pretty expensive. If you're a developmental biologist, there's a lot of jobs, mostly focused on research because there's still a ton to know. Um, Two final things is I had mentioned biology 1198. They argue the cell's the most important. Remember, I said that cells don't feed and reproduce on their own without the organism unless they are the cell. If the bacterial cell is the cell, well, okay, then the cell is the organism. Um, if you take biology 1198, that course is really focused on atoms, molecules, organelles, and cells. They might touch on tissues. This course, organismal biologist, tends to be cell and above. We'll touch on the others, but we're going to be more focused at the higher levels. Plus, above that, the ecology and evolution. Okay, I do want to mention a little evolutionary argument. We'll talk about evolution starting in another week or two. But I do want to give you a little cool idea. So you might have had the question, how is it that an eye evolves? And that's a really classic question to think about. The eye is an amazingly complicated organ. It's part of the nervous system or the sensory system. Sometimes these organ systems come by different names. Um, well, how does an organ evolve? Well, the way I like to think of it is development. At one point, you have a cell. It's one cell. If you're one cell, can you have an eye? No, because a cell can't have an eye, an organ, unless there's a lot of cells that start dividing into tissues. So, at one point, think about your life. You were one cell. We'll give it a fancy name called a zygote. But when the sperm and egg in an animal fertilize each other, they form a single cell called a zygote. Can a zygote, the pre-embryo, an embryo needs multiple cells, so it's not an embryo yet. Can that zygote have an eye? No, because according to the structural hierarchy, it's only one cell, and one cell cannot be an organ. So it divides into two cells, to many cells. At some point, those cells become tissues. Those tissues become differentiated into organs. So how did you go from one cell to an organism with an eye? Well, it was development. You, through DNA, through molecules of DNA, plus proteins that get expressed from those DNA, grew cells that differentiated into different kinds of cells, into tissues and organs. That's the process of development. At one point, you didn't have an eye, but now you do. That's development. And the process by which this happened is basically evolution. Instead of looking at one lifetime, look at many generations of lifetime, development playing out, changing those genes through time. That's evolution. That's how eyes evolve. So the process of development is going to turn out to be really important in the concept of evolution. Okay, let's end with a question here. So here's a bird, pretty cool animal. Which of the following is not a tissue that is found in this animal? Again, don't just listen to me. Pause your computer for a minute. So is it connective tissue, hormonal tissue, epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, or nervous tissue? Pause your computer. The answer here is hormonal tissue. There is no thing called hormonal tissue. Hormones are molecules, they're at the molecular level. If you're an animal, you're going to have connective tissue. They make tendons and ligaments, epithelial tissue making skin and lining of hearts and brains and intestines, muscle tissue to make the muscles and other things, and nervous tissue to make the nerves and things like that. Okay, with that, we will call this done for today, and we'll pick up with how we understand species and organisms and what they do next time.